The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as King Charles sat in his private study, staring at the stack of official documents before him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his fountain pen, a gift from his late mother, Queen Elizabeth. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, knocked gently on the door before entering. Her presence brought a warmth to the room that had been missing for weeks. She carried a tea tray, something she had insisted on doing herself rather than leaving it to the staff. The simple act spoke volumes about her character and the genuine care she held for her father-in-law. "You haven't eaten anything since yesterday evening," Catherine said softly, setting the tray on the side table. Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had learned to navigate the delicate balance between respect for the monarchy and genuine human concern. Charles looked up from his papers, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness that seemed to have settled permanently in recent weeks. The lines on his face appeared deeper, carved by sleepless nights and difficult decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. He managed a weak smile for Catherine, grateful for her presence during these troubled times. "I keep thinking about what Mother would have done," Charles admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission was rare for a man who had spent his entire life maintaining the stoic facade expected of royalty. She always seemed to know the right path forward, even when the choices were impossible. Catherine moved closer, her own experiences with public scrutiny and family challenges, giving her unique insight into Charles's struggles. She had watched him grapple with decisions that would affect not just his personal happiness, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. The situation with Camilla had reached a breaking point that none of them had anticipated. The tension in the palace had been building for months. What had started as whispered conversations among staff had grown into something that could no longer be ignored. Camilla's recent public statements had created a rift that seemed impossible to bridge, challenging not just Charles personally, but the unity that the royal family desperately needed to maintain. "Sometimes the heart and duty pull us in different directions," Catherine offered, settling into the chair across from his desk. Her own journey into the royal family had taught her about the constant struggle between personal desires and public expectations. She understood the weight of every decision and how it rippled outward to affect millions of people. Charles set down his pen and rubbed his temples, where a persistent headache had taken residence. The decision he faced was one that would define his reign and potentially change the course of royal history. The advisors had presented their arguments, the constitutional experts had weighed in, but ultimately the choice rested with him alone. "I never imagined it would come to this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The man who had waited decades to become king now found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about love, duty, and leadership. The fairy tale romance that the public had eventually embraced had become a nightmare that threatened everything he held dear. Catherine reached across the desk and placed her hand gently over his. The gesture was simple but profound, offering comfort without judgment. She had witnessed the slow deterioration of Charles and Camilla's relationship, watching as misunderstandings grew into accusations and love transformed into something unrecognizable. "The people are watching," Catherine reminded him gently. "They need to see strength and unity from their king. Whatever decision you make, it must come from a place of conviction, not doubt." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of public opinion while maintaining her own integrity. Charles nodded, understanding the truth in her words. The monarchy's survival depended on public trust and respect, both of which had been shaken by the recent controversies. Every photograph, every public appearance, every statement was scrutinized and analyzed for signs of weakness or instability. The irony was not lost on him that Catherine, who had once been criticized by some for not being born into nobility, had become one of the most stabilizing influences in his life. Her common-sense approach and genuine empathy had won over not just the public, but the family members who had initially harbored doubts about her suitability for royal life. "William is concerned about you," Catherine continued, referring to her husband's worry about his father's state of mind. The entire family had watched Charles struggle with the impossible situation, torn between his personal feelings and his duty to the crown. The stress was taking a visible toll on his health and his ability to carry out his royal duties. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Charles's private secretary entered with a grave expression, carrying yet another folder of urgent matters requiring the king's attention. The outside world continued to demand his focus even as his personal world crumbled around him. "Your Majesty," the secretary began carefully, "the Prime Minister is requesting an audience. The situation requires immediate attention." The coded language spoke to the urgency of the matter while maintaining the discretion that such sensitive issues demanded. Charles sighed deeply, knowing that the moment of decision had arrived. The luxury of contemplation and private struggle was ending, replaced by the harsh reality of public accountability. He looked at Catherine one more time, drawing strength from her steady presence and unwavering support. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of genuine gratitude. In a world where everyone seemed to have an agenda or ulterior motive, Catherine's sincere concern stood out like a beacon of hope in the darkness that had enveloped his personal life. As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "remember that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt, but sometimes that's necessary to clear the path forward." Her words hung in the air long after she left, offering both warning and encouragement for the difficult choices ahead. Charles remained alone with his thoughts, knowing that the decision he made in the coming hours would reshape not just his own life, but the future of the monarchy itself. The weight of history pressed down upon him as he prepared to take the most difficult step of his reign. The palace corridors felt different that afternoon as Charles walked toward the blue drawing room where Camilla waited. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors, each sound seeming to mark another step toward an irreversible decision. The portraits of his ancestors watched from their gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge the choice he was about to make. Camilla stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light streaming through the tall glass panes. She had been his companion through decades of controversy and criticism, standing by him when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. Now that same strength that had once been their foundation had become a source of division. "You've made your decision," she said without turning around. Her voice carried the resignation of someone who had seen this moment approaching for weeks. The pride that had defined her throughout their relationship remained intact, even as she faced the possibility of losing everything she had fought so hard to achieve. Charles closed the door behind him, ensuring their privacy for what might be their final conversation as husband and wife. The room that had witnessed countless royal celebrations and diplomatic meetings would now host the dissolution of a love story that had captivated and divided the nation for decades. "The constitutional crisis cannot continue," Charles replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "The monarchy must come first. It always has and it always will." The words felt foreign on his tongue, even though he had rehearsed them countless times in his mind. Camilla finally turned to face him, her composure intact despite the pain visible in her eyes. She had always understood the precarious nature of her position, the constant scrutiny and criticism that came with being the woman who had allegedly broken up a fairy tale marriage. Now that understanding would be put to its ultimate test. "I won't make this easy for you," she said, her chin lifted in defiance.
"If you want me gone, you'll have to be the one to say it clearly."
"No lawyers, no intermediaries. Just you and me. After everything we've been through together." The challenge in her voice reminded Charles of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. Her refusal to be intimidated by protocol or public opinion had been refreshing in a world where everyone seemed to say only what they thought he wanted to hear. But that same quality had also led to the current crisis that threatened to tear apart the monarchy itself. Charles moved to his desk and opened the leather folder that contained the papers his legal team had prepared. The documents represented months of careful planning and constitutional research, designed to minimize the damage to the crown while addressing the impossible situation they found themselves in. "The annulment papers are ready," he said quietly, unable to meet her eyes as he spoke the words that would end their marriage. "The Archbishop has agreed to the proceedings and Parliament has been briefed on the situation. Everything has been arranged to protect the dignity of the crown." Camilla laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar in the formal setting of the royal residence. "Protect the dignity of the crown," she repeated mockingly. "What about protecting the dignity of the woman who stood by you for 40 years? What about the promises you made when we finally married?" The accusation hit Charles like a physical blow, each word carrying the weight of their shared history. He remembered their wedding day, the joy they had felt at finally being able to marry openly after years of secrecy and scandal. The public had gradually accepted their relationship, but recent events had shattered that fragile peace. "You know why this is necessary," Charles said, finally finding the courage to look at her directly. "Your recent statements to the press, the way you've positioned yourself against Catherine and William, the public feuds with other family members. The people are losing faith in the monarchy because of the constant drama." Camilla's composure cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath her defiant exterior. She had spent years learning to navigate the complex world of royal protocol and public expectations, only to find herself cast as the villain in a story she had never wanted to be part of. "I spoke my truth," she said firmly. "I defended myself against the attacks and the constant comparisons to Diana's ghost. I refuse to apologize for standing up for my place in this family and in your life." The mention of Diana hung heavy in the air between them, the specter of Charles's first wife continuing to influence their relationship even decades after her death. The public had never fully forgiven either of them for the role they played in the breakdown of that marriage, and recent events had reopened old wounds that had never properly healed. Charles picked up the fountain pen that would formally begin the process of ending their marriage. The weight of the simple instrument felt enormous in his hand, representing not just the end of their relationship but potentially the beginning of a new chapter for the monarchy. "I've spoken with Catherine," he admitted quietly. "She's offered to help with the transition to ensure that the public messaging is handled properly. The family will present a united front and will move forward together." The mention of Catherine's involvement was the final straw for Camilla. Her eyes flashed with anger and betrayal, seeing in Charles's words confirmation of her worst fears about her daughter-in-law's influence over the family. "Of course she has," Camilla said bitterly, the perfect princess swooping in to save the monarchy from the wicked stepmother. "How convenient that your heir's wife is so eager to help remove the obstacle to her own ambitions." Charles shook his head, frustrated by Camilla's continued inability to see Catherine's genuine intentions. "This isn't about ambition or power plays. Catherine is thinking about the stability of the institution and the well-being of the family, something you seem to have forgotten in your determination to fight every battle publicly." The conversation had reached the point of no return, with both parties entrenched in their positions and unable to find common ground. The love that had once sustained them through decades of adversity now seemed insufficient to bridge the gulf that had opened between them. "Sign the papers, Charles," Camilla said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "If this is what you want, if throwing away our marriage is the price of keeping your precious crown, then do it. But don't expect me to pretend this is anything other than what it is. Betrayal of everything we meant to each other." Charles's hand trembled as he approached the documents, knowing that his signature would change not just his personal life, but potentially the entire trajectory of his reign. The decision that had seemed clear in the morning now felt impossible, as he faced the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. The silence in the blue drawing room stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Charles's pen hovered over the signature line, his entire life seeming to hang in the balance of this single moment. Outside, the late afternoon shadows grew longer across the castle grounds, mirroring the darkness that had settled over their relationship. Camilla watched him struggle with the decision, her own heart breaking despite her determination to maintain her dignity. She had known this day might come, had seen the writing on the wall for months as public opinion shifted and family dynamics became increasingly strained. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were entirely different things. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Camilla said softly, referring to Diana without speaking her name. "Even now, after all these years, she's still here in this room with us, still influencing every decision you make, still the ghost you can never quite escape." Charles looked up from the papers, his eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than the current crisis. The truth in Camilla's words cut through him like a knife, forcing him to confront feelings he had spent decades trying to bury. Diana's memory had indeed shaped every aspect of his reign and his relationships, creating standards and expectations that seemed impossible to meet. "This isn't about Diana," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't entirely true. Everything was about Diana in some way, her legacy casting a shadow over the monarchy that no amount of time seemed able to diminish. The public's enduring love for his first wife had made acceptance of Camilla an uphill battle from the very beginning. "Isn't it?" Camilla challenged, stepping closer to the desk. The perfect princess, tragically taken too soon, leaving behind 2 grieving sons and a nation that worshipped her memory. "I've spent 20 years trying to fill shoes that were never meant for me, competing with a saint that I could never hope to equal." The rawness of her admission hung between them, revealing the insecurity and pain that had driven many of her recent decisions, the constant comparisons, the cruel headlines, the knowledge that a significant portion of the British people would never fully accept her as Charles's wife had taken their toll over the years. Charles set the pen down and moved away from the desk, unable to bear the weight of the decision any longer. He walked to the same window where Camilla had stood earlier, looking out at the gardens that Diana had once loved to walk through. The irony of the location for this conversation was not lost on either of them. "I loved you both," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "In different ways at different times, but completely and honestly. That's been my tragedy and my burden. The world wanted me to choose long ago, but I couldn't let go of either love." Camilla joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell her familiar perfume, the scent that had comforted him through countless difficult moments over the decades. For a brief instant, it felt like they were just Charles and Camilla again, not king and queen consort, not public figures scrutinized by millions, just 2 people who had found love in an impossible situation. "And now," she asked, her voice softer than it had been all afternoon, "what does your heart tell you now, when duty and love are pulling you in opposite directions?" Before Charles could answer, there was another knock at the door. This time it was William who entered, his face grave with the weight of the family crisis that threatened to engulf them all. The Prince of Wales looked between his father and stepmother, reading the tension in the room with the skill of someone who had navigated royal politics his entire life. "Catherine sent me," William said without preamble. "The Prime Minister has called an emergency session. The press has gotten wind of something, and we need to present a unified response before this spirals completely out of control." The intrusion of the outside world shattered the intimate moment between Charles and Camilla, reminding them that their personal drama had consequences far beyond their own hearts. The monarchy's stability depended on their ability to resolve this crisis quickly and decisively. Camilla turned away from the window, her moment of vulnerability replaced by the steely determination that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny. "Tell me, William," she said coolly, "what version of unity are you and your wife proposing? The one where I gracefully disappear to protect everyone else's reputation?" William's jaw tightened at the implied criticism of Catherine, but he maintained his composure with the diplomatic skill that had been drilled into him since childhood. "We're proposing the version where the family survives intact and the monarchy continues to serve the British people as it has for over 1,000 years." "How noble," Camilla replied sarcastically. "And if the price of that survival is my marriage to your father, well, that's a small sacrifice for the greater good, isn't it?" Charles stepped between them before the conversation could deteriorate further. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his position for the first time that day. "We're family and we don't turn on each other no matter how difficult the circumstances." But even as he spoke the words, Charles knew that the definition of family was about to change dramatically. The papers on his desk represented more than just the end of his marriage. They symbolized a fundamental shift in the power dynamics within the royal household. William approached his father, his expression softening with genuine concern. "Dad, I know this is impossibly difficult, but the institution has to come first. You taught me that, just as grandfather taught you. Sometimes personal happiness has to be sacrificed for the greater good." The words echoed lessons Charles had learned throughout his life, but hearing them from his son in this context felt like a betrayal of everything he had fought for in his relationship with Camilla. He had spent decades waiting to become king, believing that once he held the crown he would have the power to make the choices that had been denied to him as heir. "And what about love?" Charles asked, looking at his son with eyes that held decades of suppressed pain. "What about the promises we make to the people who stand by us through the worst times? Do those mean nothing in the face of public opinion and political convenience?" William's response was swift and certain, carrying the conviction of someone who had watched his parents' marriage destroy itself under public scrutiny. "Love isn't enough if it tears apart everything else we've built." Mother taught me that even if she never said it directly. Her love for you couldn't survive the pressure of this life. And maybe that was the lesson we were supposed to learn. The mention of Diana by William hit both Charles and Camilla like a physical blow, bringing the ghost of the past directly into their present crisis. The parallel between the two situations was unmistakable, and the implications hung heavy in the air between them. Camilla moved back toward the desk where the annulment papers waited, her decision crystallizing in the face of William's words. "Sign them, Charles," she said with quiet dignity. "Your son is right. Love isn't enough when the whole world is watching and waiting for you to fail." The following morning brought no relief from the emotional storm that had engulfed the royal family. Charles had spent the night staring at the ceiling of his private chambers, the unsigned papers lying on his nightstand like an accusation. Sleep had eluded him completely, his mind replaying every moment of his relationship with Camilla, searching for the point where love had begun to transform into something that threatened everything he held sacred. Catherine arrived at the palace early, her presence a calming influence in the chaos that had consumed the royal household. She found Charles in the breakfast room, sitting alone at the long mahogany table that could seat 20, but now felt impossibly empty with just one occupant. The untouched food on his plate spoke to his troubled state of mind. "You didn't sign them," Catherine observed, taking the seat beside him rather than across the table. The gesture was deliberate, showing support rather than confrontation. She had learned through her own difficult introduction to royal life that sometimes physical proximity could convey understanding better than words. Charles nodded slowly, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. "I kept thinking about our wedding day," he admitted. The joy on her face, the relief that we could finally be together openly after all those years of hiding. How do I destroy that with a signature on a legal document? Catherine understood the weight of such memories, having experienced her own moments of pure happiness within the constraints of royal life. Her wedding to William had been a global celebration, but it had also marked the beginning of a life where every private moment could become public property. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let someone go," Catherine said gently. "Continuing to fight a losing battle doesn't honor what you had together. It destroys it piece by piece until nothing beautiful remains." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had watched relationships crumble under public pressure, who understood that love alone could not sustain a partnership when the entire world seemed determined to tear it apart. The scrutiny that came with royal life had claimed many victims over the years. Charles looked at Catherine with genuine appreciation for her perspective. She had managed to maintain her marriage to William despite enormous pressure, had found ways to protect their relationship while still fulfilling her public duties. Her success made her advice all the more valuable in his current crisis. "Camilla thinks you're behind this," Charles said quietly. "She believes you've been working to remove her from the family, positioning yourself as the power behind the throne." Catherine's expression remained calm despite the accusation. She had faced similar criticisms throughout her time in the royal family, had learned to expect suspicion and jealousy from those who felt threatened by change. "I'm behind the survival of the monarchy," she replied simply. "That's my only agenda, and it's one that should unite us all." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several palace staff members, their faces grave with the urgency of the developing crisis. The king's private secretary approached with a folder of morning newspapers, their headlines screaming about palace intrigue and royal divorce rumors. "Your Majesty," the secretary said carefully, "the press is demanding a statement. The speculation is becoming increasingly wild, and some of the stories are beginning to affect public confidence in the monarchy itself." Charles glanced at the headlines, each one more sensational than the last. The British tabloids had seized upon the rumors with their characteristic enthusiasm for royal drama, creating narratives that bore little resemblance to the actual events unfolding behind palace walls. "What does the Prime Minister advise?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Political leaders rarely had patience for royal complications that might affect their own popularity or effectiveness. "Swift resolution," the secretary replied, diplomatically. "The government cannot afford to be distracted by constitutional questions about the stability of the monarchy. There are too many other pressing issues requiring attention." Catherine stood up, moving to look out the window at the crowds that had begun gathering outside the palace gates. Even in the early morning, dozens of people held vigil, some supporting Charles and Camilla, others calling for decisive action to protect the monarchy's reputation. "They're all waiting," she observed quietly. "The country, the Commonwealth, the world. Everyone is watching to see what kind of king you'll be when faced with an impossible choice." The weight of that observation settled over Charles like a heavy cloak. His entire life had been preparation for this role, but nothing had truly prepared him for decisions that pitted his personal happiness against his duty to the crown. Previous monarchs had faced similar choices, but none in the age of instant communication and relentless media scrutiny. "I need to see her," Charles said suddenly, rising from his chair with newfound determination. "I need to talk to Camilla one more time before any irreversible decisions are made." Catherine nodded, understanding that closure was necessary for both of them, regardless of what form it ultimately took. "I'll handle the press briefing," she offered. "We can buy you a few more hours before any official statements need to be made." As Charles prepared to leave, Catherine placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Remember," she said softly, "whatever you decide, it needs to be something you can live with for the rest of your reign. Some choices can't be undone, and regret is a heavy burden for a king to carry." Charles found Camilla in her private sitting room, surrounded by boxes and suitcases that suggested she had already begun preparing for the possibility of departure. The sight of her packing hit him like a physical blow, making the potential end of their relationship suddenly seem brutally real. "You're leaving," he stated, rather than asked. Camilla looked up from the photograph she had been wrapping in tissue paper, her eyes red-rimmed from crying despite her attempts to maintain composure. "I'm preparing for the inevitable," she replied. "We both know how this story ends, Charles. We've both known for weeks." Charles closed the door behind him and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, careful not to disturb the items she had been packing. The photograph in her hands was from their honeymoon, a private moment of happiness captured before the weight of public duty had reasserted itself. "I don't want it to end this way," he said honestly. "After everything we've survived together, all the battles we've fought side by side, I can't bear the thought of our story finishing with lawyers and constitutional crises." Camilla set the photograph aside and took his hands in hers, their familiar touch providing comfort even in their darkest moment. "Then tell me," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Tell me there's another way. Tell me you found a solution that doesn't require me to disappear from your life." The desperation in her voice nearly broke his resolve, reminding him of all the reasons he had fallen in love with her in the first place. But the harsh reality of their situation could not be changed by love alone, no matter how deep or enduring it might be. "The monarchy comes first," Charles said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "It has to. That's the choice I made when I accepted the crown, and it's a choice that affects millions of people beyond just us." Camilla nodded slowly, having expected this answer even while hoping for a different one. "I know," she whispered. "I've always known. I just hoped that maybe this time love might be enough." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace as Charles made his way to the throne room, where the most significant decision of his reign would be formalized. The ornate chamber, with its crimson and gold decorations, had witnessed countless moments of royal history, but none quite like this. Today, it would see a king choose duty over love in the most public way possible. Catherine waited near the gilded throne, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of what the future might hold. She wore a simple black dress that conveyed both dignity and solemnity, understanding that this moment would be remembered and analyzed by historians for generations to come. Her role had evolved from supportive family member to crucial figure in the monarchy's survival. "The Archbishop is ready," Catherine informed Charles quietly as he approached. "The constitutional lawyers have confirmed that all procedures have been followed correctly. When you're ready, we can proceed with the formal announcement." Charles nodded, though his hand trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve the signed annulment papers. The signature he had finally added that morning felt like it had cost him a piece of his soul, but he had come to understand that some sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. The heavy doors of the throne room opened to admit several key figures: the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, the Lord Chamberlain, and other senior officials whose presence lent gravity and legitimacy to the proceedings. Each face reflected the seriousness of the moment and the historical significance of what was about to unfold. William entered last, his expression carefully neutral despite the emotional turmoil that Charles knew his son was experiencing. The Prince of Wales had been thrust into the role of supporting his father through this crisis, while also preparing for his own eventual reign, a burden that no amount of training could have fully prepared him for. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop began formally, "we are gathered here to witness the formal dissolution of your marriage to Queen Camilla, as requested by both parties and approved by the Church of England. This decision has been made in accordance with constitutional law and in the best interests of the monarchy." The formal language could not disguise the profound personal pain underlying these proceedings. Charles looked around the room at the faces of people who had served the crown faithfully for years, knowing that they were witnessing what might be remembered as either the salvation or the tragedy of his reign. "Before we proceed," Charles said, his voice carrying across the ornate chamber, "I want it understood that this decision reflects no failure of character on the part of Queen Camilla. She has served this country with distinction and dignity, and any suggestion otherwise dishonors both her service and this institution." The statement was both a tribute to Camilla and a warning to those who might be tempted to portray her as the villain in this story. Charles was determined that history would remember her contributions, even if their marriage could not survive the pressures of modern monarchy. Catherine stepped forward, her movement subtle but significant. "I would like to add," she said clearly, "that Queen Camilla's grace throughout this difficult period has been an example to us all. The royal family will always be grateful for her dedication to the crown and her service to the British people." The gesture surprised everyone in the room, particularly given the tensions that had existed between the two women. Catherine's public support for Camilla at this crucial moment demonstrated a political sophistication and personal generosity that further established her credentials as a future queen. The Archbishop proceeded with the formal reading of the annulment decree, his voice echoing in the vast chamber as he pronounced the legal end of Charles and Camilla's marriage. The ancient words seemed to carry extra weight in this historic setting, surrounded by portraits of monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices. As the ceremony concluded, Charles felt a profound emptiness settle over him. The crown that had been his destiny for decades now felt like a burden he wasn't sure he wanted to bear. The price of wearing it had proven higher than he had ever imagined possible. "The formal announcement will be made to the public within the hour," the Prime Minister informed the gathering. "We have prepared a statement that emphasizes the continuity of the monarchy and the stability of the government. The focus will be on moving forward rather than dwelling on the circumstances that led to this decision." Charles understood the political necessity of controlling the narrative, but he also knew that the personal cost of this decision would linger long after the headlines faded. Some wounds never fully healed, and some choices continued to echo through the years in ways that could never be fully anticipated. As the officials began to file out of the throne room, Catherine approached Charles with quiet determination. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said softly. "Camilla asked me to give you this." She handed him a sealed envelope, her expression conveying both sympathy and strength. The handwriting on the outside was unmistakably Camilla's, and Charles felt his heart clench at the sight of the familiar script that had filled so many love letters over the decades. "She left this morning," Catherine continued gently. "She wanted to avoid any media circus around her departure. The last thing she said was that she hoped you would find peace with your decision." Charles clutched the letter, knowing that it contained Camilla's final words to him as his wife. The reality of her absence hit him with unexpected force, making the enormous throne room feel suddenly cold and empty, despite the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. William approached his father, his own emotions carefully controlled but visible to those who knew him well. "The transition will be difficult," he acknowledged quietly, "but we'll get through it together, as a family. That's what Mother would have wanted." The reference to Diana was deliberate, invoking her memory as a source of strength and guidance during this dark period. Charles understood that his son was trying to provide comfort, while also ensuring that the monarchy's future remained secure. "Catherine has agreed to take on additional duties," William continued, "to help fill the void left by Camilla's departure. The public needs to see strength and continuity, especially during the adjustment period. Charles looked at Catherine with profound gratitude, understanding the sacrifice she was making by accepting greater responsibility during an already challenging time. Her willingness to step forward when the family needed her most demonstrated the qualities that would make her an exceptional queen when her time came. "Thank you," Charles said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't express. In losing Camilla, he had discovered just how crucial Catherine had become to the family's stability and future. As the afternoon drew to a close, Charles remained alone in the throne room, still holding Camilla's unopened letter. The decision had been made, the formalities completed, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. He had chosen his crown over his heart, but the victory felt hollow in ways he had never expected. Outside, the crowds were gathering in anticipation of the official announcement. Soon, the world would know that King Charles III had sacrificed his marriage to preserve the monarchy, a decision that would define his reign and shape the future of the royal family for generations to come. 3 weeks had passed since the announcement that shook the monarchy to its core. The British public had responded with a mixture of shock, sympathy, and grudging respect for Charles's decision to put duty before personal happiness. The headlines had gradually shifted from sensational speculation to more measured analysis of what this meant for the future of the royal family. Charles stood in his private study at Balmoral Castle, finally having found the courage to open Camilla's letter. The Scottish Highlands provided a refuge from the intense scrutiny of London, offering him space to process the monumental changes in his life. The letter had remained sealed on his desk for weeks, a reminder of the personal cost of his royal duties. With trembling fingers, he broke the wax seal and unfolded the cream-colored paper. Camilla's familiar handwriting filled the page, each word carefully chosen for what she knew would be their final communication as husband and wife. "My dearest Charles," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be far from the life we built together, but I will never be far from the love we shared. I want you to know that I understand your choice, even if my heart breaks with the understanding. You were always meant to be king, and perhaps I was never meant to be your queen." Charles had to pause, the weight of her words overwhelming him with guilt and sorrow. Outside his window, the Scottish moors stretched endlessly, their wild beauty a stark contrast to the pain contained within those carefully written lines. The letter continued, "I have watched you struggle with this decision, and I know the cost it has exacted from your soul, but I also know that you made the only choice that a true king could make. The crown demands sacrifices that ordinary people cannot understand, and love alone is not always enough to overcome those demands." A soft knock on the study door interrupted his reading. Catherine entered quietly, carrying a tea tray and wearing the concerned expression that had become familiar during these difficult weeks. She had stepped seamlessly into the role of family anchor, providing stability when everything else seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. "The children are asking about you," Catherine said gently, referring to her own children who had noticed their grandfather's prolonged absence from family gatherings. George specifically asked when Grandpa Charles would be ready to play football with him again. The mention of his grandchildren brought a small smile to Charles's face, the first genuine expression of joy he had shown in weeks. The innocence of their love offered a pure form of comfort that adult relationships, complicated by duty and expectation, could no longer provide. "Tell him soon," Charles replied, carefully folding Camilla's letter and placing it in his desk drawer. "I just need a little more time to find my footing again." Catherine set the tea tray on the side table and took her usual seat across from his desk. Her presence had become a constant source of support, her practical wisdom and genuine empathy helping to guide him through the darkest period of his reign. "The constitutional lawyers have confirmed that the succession remains unchanged," Catherine reported, addressing one of the key concerns that had emerged in the aftermath of the annulment. "Your decision to end the marriage actually strengthens the monarchy's position." According to the experts, Charles nodded, understanding the political implications even as his heart struggled to accept the personal consequences. The irony was not lost on him, that destroying his own happiness had somehow enhanced his effectiveness as king. "Have there been any updates about Camilla?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the pain that still accompanied any mention of her name. Catherine's expression softened with sympathy. "She's staying with friends in France," she replied carefully. "By all accounts, she's handling the transition with dignity. There have been no public statements or media appearances. She's honoring the agreement completely. The news brought both relief and fresh sorrow. Charles was grateful that Camilla was maintaining the discretion they had agreed upon, but her silence also emphasized the finality of their separation. She was truly gone from his life, existing now only in memory and in the letter he had just read. "William wants to visit," Catherine continued, changing the subject to lighter matters. "He thinks it would be good for you to have family around, and the children are eager to explore the Scottish countryside." The prospect of his son's visit brought warmth to Charles's heart. William had been a pillar of strength throughout the crisis, supporting his father's decision while also preparing to shoulder additional responsibilities as heir to the throne. "That would be wonderful," Charles agreed. "This place has always been healing for our family. Maybe it can work its magic once again." As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door with the thoughtful expression that usually preceded her most insightful observations. "You know," she said quietly, "in some ways your decision has made you a better king. The public sees someone who puts duty above personal desire, who makes hard choices for the greater good. That's the kind of leadership they need right now." Her words carried wisdom that Charles was only beginning to understand. The sacrifice he had made, devastating as it was personally, had earned him a kind of respect and moral authority that might not have been possible otherwise. Sometimes leadership required bearing burdens that others could not imagine. Alone again in his study, Charles returned to Camilla's letter, reading the final paragraphs that he had not yet had the courage to face. "I want you to embrace your role without the shadow of our controversy hanging over you," she had written. "You have the opportunity now to be the king you were always meant to be, free from the complications that our love created. That is my final gift to you, even though it costs me everything." The letter concluded with words that would remain with him for the rest of his life. "Remember me not as the woman who complicated your reign, but as someone who loved you completely and who understood. In the end, that true love sometimes means letting go. Be the king our country needs, my darling. That will be my lasting happiness." Charles folded the letter carefully and returned it to his desk drawer, next to the fountain pen his mother had given him. The two objects represented the twin pillars of his existence, love and duty, forever intertwined yet forever in conflict. Outside, the Scottish sky was beginning to darken as evening approached. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, new opportunities to serve his people and justify the enormous sacrifice he had made. For now, though, he allowed himself to grieve for what he had lost, while also acknowledging the strange peace that had begun to settle over his troubled heart. The king had made his choice, and slowly, painfully, he was beginning to understand that it might have been the right one after all. 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon in the throne room, and the monarchy had not only survived the crisis, but had emerged stronger than many had dared to hope. Charles stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, watching as thousands of people gathered below for the Trooping the Color ceremony, their faces upturned with genuine affection and respect. Catherine appeared beside him, resplendent in a deep blue dress that perfectly captured the solemnity and joy of the occasion. Her transformation into the family's anchor had been complete and remarkable, earning her widespread admiration from both the public and the press. She had become the embodiment of modern royal duty, balancing tradition with contemporary relevance. "The crowds are larger than we expected," Catherine observed, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction at the public's response. "The polls show approval ratings higher than they've been in decades. People respect what you did, Charles. They see a king who puts country before personal happiness." Charles nodded, feeling a complex mixture of pride and melancholy as he looked out at the sea of faces. The sacrifice had indeed paid dividends in terms of public support, but the personal cost remained a constant ache in his heart. Success in royal terms was measured differently than in ordinary life. "Any word from France?" he asked quietly, the question that had become his regular inquiry about Camilla's well-being. Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "She's well," she replied gently. "The reports suggest she's found peace in her new life. There was a photograph in a French magazine showing her at a charity event, looking genuinely happy. Perhaps the freedom from public scrutiny has been healing for her too." The news brought Charles both comfort and a sharp pang of loss. He was glad that Camilla had found happiness, But her ability to thrive without him also emphasized how completely their shared life had ended. Some wounds healed by creating distance from what had caused them. William emerged onto the balcony, his presence commanding even in the shadow of his father's authority. The months since the crisis had seen him step more fully into his role as heir, taking on additional duties and responsibilities with the confidence of someone born to lead. "The family is ready," William announced, referring to the other royals who would join them for the public appearance. "The children are particularly excited. George keeps asking if he'll be king someday like Grandpa Charles." The innocence of his grandson's question brought a genuine smile to Charles's face. The next generation remained untouched by the adult complications that had nearly torn the family apart, their love simple and unconditional in ways that offered hope for the future. "And what did you tell him?" Charles asked. "I told him that kings have to make very hard choices," William replied thoughtfully, "and that sometimes being strong means doing things that make you sad, because it's what's best for everyone else." The wisdom in his son's words reflected lessons learned through recent events, understanding that had been earned through witnessing his father's agonizing decision. William's own preparation for kingship had been accelerated by the crisis, forcing him to confront the realities of royal duty earlier than anyone had anticipated. Catherine moved to stand between the two men, her gesture unconsciously creating a symbol of unity and continuity. The three of them represented the past, present, and future of the monarchy, bonded by shared sacrifice and common purpose. "Shall we?" she asked, indicating the doors that led back into the palace where the rest of the family waited. As they moved toward the interior, Charles caught Catherine's hand in his, squeezing it gently in a gesture of gratitude and affection. The touch was brief but meaningful, acknowledging the crucial role she had played in holding the family together during its darkest hour. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of months of unspoken appreciation for her unwavering support and practical wisdom. Catherine returned the pressure of his hand, understanding passing between them without need for further words. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than mere family connection, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the institution they both served. The royal family gathered in the palace's center room, a picture of unity and purpose that would soon be broadcast around the world. The children chattered excitedly about the ceremony, their enthusiasm infectious despite the adults' awareness of the symbolic importance of the moment. As they prepared to step onto the balcony together, Charles felt a profound sense of completion that had been missing for months. The hole left by Camilla's absence would never be entirely filled, but it had been surrounded by new forms of love and support that gave his life different but equally meaningful purpose. The crowds below erupted in cheers as the royal family appeared, their approval washing over the balcony like a warm wave of acceptance and affection. Charles raised his hand in acknowledgement, feeling for the first time since the crisis began that he had truly become the king his people needed him to be. Catherine stood slightly behind him and to his right, her position both respectful of his authority and indicative of her growing importance within the family structure. The symbolism would not be lost on observers, who had begun to see her as the unofficial First Lady of the royal household. In the months to come, there would be more challenges and decisions to face, more tests of his commitment to duty over personal desire. But standing on that balcony, surrounded by family and cheered by his people, Charles felt a quiet confidence that he had chosen correctly. The crown had indeed demanded everything of him, including the love he had cherished for decades. But in return, it had given him something equally precious, the knowledge that he had earned his place as king not through birthright alone, but through sacrifice and service that demonstrated his true worthiness to lead. As the ceremony continued below, and the crowds celebrated their monarch, Charles allowed himself one final thought of Camilla, hoping that somewhere in France, she could see the strength and stability that her sacrifice had made possible. Their love story had ended, but its final chapter had enabled something greater than either of them alone could have achieved. The king had found his heart again, not in romantic love, but in the deep satisfaction of serving his people with honor and dignity. It was, he realized, exactly what Camilla had hoped for when she wrote that final letter, her last gift to the man she had loved completely enough to let him go.